For as long as he could remember, Lucas always felt that his family was different. Not because they were eccentric or peculiar, but because of the inexplicable connection they seemed to have with the supernatural. Stories of strange events and apparitions were common in family conversations, passed down from generation to generation like tales of holidays or year-end celebrations. For Lucas, growing up amidst these stories was both exciting and unsettling, but he could never have predicted how these experiences would become such an intimate and inescapable part of his life. The house where Lucas spent his childhood was located in a rural area, surrounded by fields and forests. It was an old house built in the late 19th century, with thick wooden walls and floors that creaked with the slightest movement. From an early age, he knew that the house had a dark history. His grandparents told him about the strange events they experienced when they first moved in, and how over the years those experiences had become almost routine. The first event Lucas clearly remembered happened when he was about 7 years old. It was a winter night, and he was lying in bed trying to sleep when he heard heavy footsteps in the hallway. At first, he thought it was his father, who often stayed up late, walking around the house. But the footsteps were different, heavy and dragging, as if whoever was walking was carrying a great weight. Lucas, with his childlike curiosity, got out of bed and went to his bedroom door. When he opened it, expecting to see his father, the hallway was empty, lit only by the soft glow of moonlight streaming through the window. Despite the cold, Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. He hesitated for a moment but decided to go back to bed, convinced that his imagination was playing tricks on him. The next morning, when he told his parents about what had happened, they didn't seem surprised. His mother, with an understanding look, just told him that the house was old and it was common to hear strange noises. But Lucas noticed something different in his father's expression, a slight furrowing of the brows that indicated concern. He didn't know it at the time, but that was just the beginning of a series of events that would shape his childhood and his view of the world. As the years passed, Lucas began to realize that the strange occurrences in the house weren't just occasional. They were part of the family's daily life. There were the doors that opened and closed on their own, even when there were no drafts, the lights that flickered inexplicably, and the objects that moved without anyone touching them. But what bothered him the most were the voices. Sometimes, when he was alone in a room, Lucas would hear whispers coming from dark corners or empty rooms. They were low, indistinct voices, but filled with an urgency he couldn't ignore. One summer afternoon, Lucas was in the living room drawing in his notebook when he heard a soft laugh coming from upstairs. It was a child's laugh, something that made him think of his younger sister, Clara. But when he went upstairs to check, he found the rooms empty. Clara was in the backyard, playing with her dolls, and his mother was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. Lucas felt a knot in his stomach, a sense that something was definitely wrong. As he descended the stairs again, he had the distinct impression that he was being watched. That night, while getting ready for bed, Lucas couldn't shake the laugh from his mind. He wondered if the house held some memory of its former inhabitants, if the wooden walls and floorboards were like tapes that recorded echoes of the past. It was the first time he seriously considered the possibility that the house was haunted, not just by one spirit, but by an entire history of events that continued to unfold in an endless cycle. The experiences weren't exclusive to Lucas. His parents and grandparents had their own stories as well. His mother, for example, often reported seeing a woman in a long dress wandering the upstairs hallway at night. She could never see the woman's face, who always seemed to disappear before she could get close. His father, on the other hand, had a more direct encounter when one night, while going down the stairs to get a glass of water, he felt a cold hand grab his shoulder, only to turn around and find no one there. These stories weren't told often, but when they were, there was always a tone of acceptance in the narrator's voice, as if the supernatural was just a natural part of life in the house. When Lucas asked why they never considered moving, the answer was always the same. This is our home. These things happen, and we've learned to live with them. This quiet acceptance from Lucas's family left him torn. Part of him wanted to understand and accept it, as the others seemed to do. But another part, the part that still clung to skepticism and logic, refused to accept the idea that these experiences were normal. As Lucas grew older, The paranormal activities in the house didn't decrease. If anything, they seemed to intensify. When he was about 15, he decided he wanted to discover the truth about what was happening. He began spending more time alone in the house, trying to capture evidence of the phenomena he and his family experienced. He set up audio recorders in various rooms, left cameras filming during the night, and even started asking questions out loud when he felt he wasn't alone. The results were disturbing. In several recordings, he captured noises he couldn't explain, scratches, thumps, and in some, whispered voices that seemed to respond to his questions. One of the most unsettling audios was recorded during the night while he was asleep. In the recording, you could hear his deep breathing, and then a low, hoarse male voice saying his name repeatedly, "Lucas, Lucas." When he listened to the recording, Lucas felt a cold shiver run down his spine. There was no denying that something or someone was trying to communicate with him. Lucas's experiences began to affect his sleep and daily life. He became increasingly reclusive, avoiding talking about what was happening with his friends and even his family. He felt that somehow he was being chosen by these entities, as if they knew he was trying to understand, and therefore showed themselves more to him. This unwanted attention left him exhausted and anxious, and he began to wonder if he should continue his investigations or simply accept the inexplicable, as his parents had always done. It was during a weekend when Lucas's family was away that things reached a critical point. He decided to stay home alone to continue his research. On the first night, around 3 in the morning, Lucas was awakened by a loud, sharp sound, as if something heavy had been slammed against the floor. Still groggy from sleep, he got up and followed the sound downstairs, where he found the living room in chaos. The chairs were overturned, books scattered on the floor, and the wall clock that always hung above the fireplace had fallen. Its hands stopped at 3 o'clock. Lucas tried to convince himself that all of it could have a logical explanation, maybe an earthquake, though he hadn't felt any tremors. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. He began putting things back in their places, but before he could finish, he heard a sound that made him freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the stairs. He was alone in the house, and those footsteps weren't his. He turned slowly, holding his breath, and saw something he would never forget. At the top of the stairs stood a shadowy figure. It had no distinct form, just a dark silhouette, almost like a three-dimensional shadow, but with a presence that was impossible to ignore. Lucas stood still, unable to move, as the figure descended the steps with slow, steady strides. The room seemed to close in around him, the air growing dense and hard to breathe. When the figure finally reached the bottom of the stairs, it stopped, as if looking directly at him, though it had no visible eyes. Lucas felt a wave of paralyzing fear, but at the same time, a strange curiosity. He wanted to understand what was happening, but at the same time, wished he had never started investigating. The silence between them was overwhelming, and Lucas realized he was in the presence of something beyond his understanding. Before he could react, the figure moved suddenly, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Lucas stood still for a moment, trying to process what had just happened, before finally retreating to the kitchen, where he turned on all the lights and sat down, trembling. He spent the rest of the night awake, with all the lights in the house on, not daring to go back upstairs. When his parents returned the next morning, he told them what had happened, hoping that, as usual, they would offer some reassuring explanation. But this time, the look on their faces was different. Not of surprise, but of silent concern, as if they knew something more serious was happening. It was decided that the family would call a priest to bless the house, something they had never done before, despite years of living with the inexplicable. The priest arrived a few days later, bringing with him a calm that seemed to ease the tension in the air. He walked through the house, sprinkling holy water in every room and reciting ancient prayers. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he paused for a moment, as if sensing the presence Lucas had encountered. He murmured a few words in Latin, and then continued the blessing. After the priest left, the house was strangely silent. Lucas noticed that the atmosphere seemed lighter, as if an invisible weight had been lifted. The phenomena that had once been a constant part of his life began to diminish. The voices ceased. The footsteps were no longer heard. and the doors stopped opening and closing on their own. The peace that finally settled over the house was a welcome relief for Lucas and his family. In the months that followed, Lucas reflected a lot on the experiences he had lived through. He never found a definitive explanation for what had happened, but he learned to accept that some things simply can't be explained. The house still held its secrets, but he no longer felt threatened by them. Instead, he found a way to coexist with the mystery, accepting that the world was much vaster and more complex than he could imagine. Lucas grew up and eventually left the house to start his own life, but the experiences he had there never completely left him. They shaped his worldview, teaching him to respect the unknown and to value the stories that a house's walls can tell. Even when he returned to visit his parents in the following years, he always looked at the stairs with a mix of respect and curiosity, remembering the shadowy figure that once stared back at him there. The house, with all its history of paranormal activity, became a place of memories for Lucas, not just of fear, but of growth and understanding. He knew that, wherever he went, the stories of that house would go with him, as a silent reminder that the inexplicable will always be a part of life, in one way or another.